The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Richard Fontaine.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this second session in a series on national security at the Sine Institute at American University. I'm Richard Fontaine. I'm a 2022 Sine Institute Fellow, and when I'm not plugging in virtually to American University, also the CEO of the Center for a New American Security. The seminar series is Crafting National Security for Today and Tomorrow, and it's focused on the chief forces that are driving today's world and how we should respond to them. Today, the topic is China, which in many ways is the preeminent foreign policy issue of our time when we're not thinking about other things like Russia invading Ukraine or other short-run challenges. The Biden administration has repeatedly identified China as the top priority of US policy, and that sentiment is broadly shared by political leaders on both sides of the aisle. But there are a lot of questions that remain. What does China want? How will it go about seeking it? What does it mean for Asia, for the United States? What should Washington do about it? So to discuss these matters, I'm really thrilled to have as our guest Elizabeth Economy. Liz is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's currently on leave serving as a senior foreign advisor in the Department of Commerce, but today is speaking in her personal capacity. Also pertinent to today's discussion is that Liz literally wrote the book on what China wants. The World According to China has been out for just a few months. And she also has a fantastic article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs where she summarizes some of her arguments. So I recommend to everyone buying the book and then reading the article or the book, depending on how much time you have. Let me kick off the conversation with Liz. And if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. So Liz, thanks for joining. Welcome, great to have you. Let me start with a big question, but it's one you know well. You know, some observers say China doesn't really seek a new international order, just kind of wants tweaks around the edges, kind of wants to make sure Communist Party stays in power and it doesn't get criticized and here and there. And then there's others that say China's got a grand plan to replace American global leadership with its own, transform the rules by which countries act. Where do you come down on that big overarching question?
Well, thanks, Richard, and it's great to be here with you. So I guess I would start by saying I think the people that argue that sort of China's approach is minimalist, that it's just seeking to sort of tinker around the edges of the current system, and that, you know, yes, China has benefited. I think the line is, you know, China has benefited from the international system and really doesn't seek to transform it, maybe just a little bit around the margins. That these people have not read anything that Xi Jinping has said over the past decade, almost decade since he came to power in the fall of 2012. I think he does have a grand vision, and it is transformative. And you know, he lays it out very clearly. He's published 3 books of his speeches to date, and just read the speeches and you can see exactly where he wants to take the country. And, you know, quickly, and we can talk, you know, more in depth about any of these areas. I guess I would just tick off, you know, sort of 5 dimensions where I really see Xi's policies as transformative. The first is, moving from what we would call staking claims around sovereignty to realizing them. And so making real progress on Taiwan and the South China Sea, with the Indian border dispute, Japan's Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. It's kind of redrawing the map of China and the region in some respects. I think second, he wants to push the United States out of East Asia as the dominant power, as the preeminent power there. Third, I think, is really embedding China's political, economic, and security interests, in other countries, spreading China's influence. And I think that's very clearly seen through the Belt and Road Initiative, which was, of course, China's, is China's grand scale infrastructure initiative that she launched in 2013, but has since morphed and evolved into something, much more. And again, we can talk, more in depth about it if you like. Fourth, I think, and in some respects more recent, is I think Xi Jinping's desire almost to insulate the Chinese economy from being buffeted from, the international community, but still remain a global economic power in a globalized economy. And I think that, reflects his dual circulation theory, where he talks about China's ability to, innovate, manufacture, and consume all within itself, basically saying, China has a large enough economy with a large enough population that we can do this. And yes, of course, we're going to export. And yes, we still want other, multinationals to be dependent on us for their supply chains. And we want some necessary, capital and know-how. But by and large, right, we're going to have this, increasingly self-sufficient economy. And then finally, and this is to your point, I think, in your introduction, I think China really does want to reshape norms and values in global governance so that they align with those of China. And it shouldn't be surprising to us. I mean, China is the second largest economy. It has the world's largest military. It wants the rest of the world, to validate its model and also to align, right? So that it's not constantly battling over things like human rights and internet governance. So I think it's far more than simply trying to protect itself from criticism, right? It really is transforming the international landscape, I think, in some fairly fundamental ways.
Yeah, and so if you had to sort of fast forward a few years and say, for the sake of argument, that China obtained those 5 goals in some large degree. Now, okay, this is a bit of a thought experiment, but my question is, what does a world look like where China achieves its goals? So the average citizen in the United States, or, for example, would they feel life differently in a world where, especially how interconnected our economies are and technology and things like that, would they feel that? Or is this something that the geopolitically minded of us sort of fret about, but is not really material to everyday life in most places?
I mean, I think there will be a couple of different ways where we would probably feel it fairly directly. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about is that, sort of threaded through many of Xi Jinping's domestic speeches, not so much the ones that are published for foreign consumption, but more internal ones, is this idea of catch up and surpass the United States, right? So across the board, certainly in, across every emerging technology, right, there's this line, catch up and surpass the United States. So when we think about American technology, or when we even think about American brands, right, as being, many of them globally dominant, famous, our brand, there are ambassadors in many respects for the United States, for our values. I think, in a China-centered world, it's China that has those dominant brands. It's Chinese technology. I mean, the interesting thing about China is, as we watch China develop right now, is that in many respects, what Xi Jinping seeks to do is take the China model, what he's done at home, export elements of it through the Belt and Road Initiative, and then reinforce them in global governance institutions. And so, one of the, I think, boldest initiatives that Xi has underway, that China has underway right now, is for something called new IP. And basically what that means, and that's something it's proposing right now in the United Nations, in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And basically that means that states would have a shut up command, right? So that it could control the internet connection to any internet connected device, right? The state could simply shut it down. So that actually represents a fairly fundamental transformation in the way that the internet operates. So would Americans feel differently? Yeah, I think so, if that were the direction in which the world was moving. So I think, and I think on a sort of more corrosive and element of China's, foreign policy, what we often term sharp power, I think we can look and see the types of actions that China's taken with regard to the NBA when countries say or do things that China doesn't like, right? It used to just be about Taiwan and Hong Kong. Well, now, the Wall Street Journal reporters are expelled because, the journal published an opinion piece that had identified China as the real sick man of Asia. Or Australia, facing a boycott of some of its most important goods to China because it called for an investigation into the origins of COVID. So, watching the world, watching the sort of erosion of free speech, right? What can be accepted, I think, would be fairly significant, and maybe it wouldn't affect, just the person walking down Main Street, but maybe it would. Certainly, it would be affecting movies that we would watch, and possibly newspapers that we would read. I think one could imagine a fairly stark, sort of dramatic representation of China's influence on the global stage.
Yeah, no, that's great. You're talking about some of the coercive steps that China has taken. The Australians had the temerity to suggest an independent inquiry into coronavirus, so unacceptable that, they hit them back in embargoing barley and wine and, and try to spread some economic pain around. And of course, that's not the only thing in the last year and a half or two. China has, alienated India big time with the border skirmish there, and sanctioned members of the European Parliament right on the eve of trying to get an investment deal done with Europe to make sure that that investment deal would not get done. The Senkakus for Japan, Taiwan, you go around. I mean, when you alienate Canada, you have to really be trying. I mean, and yet they were able to do that too. And so, looking at this from, I think, an objective perspective, it seems counterproductive because it is hastening the creation of a coalition that seeks to balance Chinese power and dominance, at least on key issues. So things are possible now, the Quad and things like that, that would not have been possible before. So why do they keep doing this? I mean, these are smart people. Do we have it wrong, or do they?
No, it's actually a central argument in my book is that, while we do need to look at China's ambition and focus on it and respond to it, we should also pay attention to the ways in which actually when China launches some of these major initiatives, they don't actually succeed. I mean, it's a slightly different point than the one you're raising, but I think it bears noting as well. Like you think about the Confucius Institutes and all of the, hullabaloo that has surrounded them. And then you look and see, in part because of that hullabaloo, I have to say, because of the pushback, from university professors and also from some officials, see that, the number of Confucius Institutes, which of course are Chinese language, training and cultural exchange institutes, peaked in 2018 and has been on the decline. And, while China pledged that it would have 1,000 of them by 2020, it has about 540 or so. So, just an example of how, just because China says something's going to happen, it doesn't necessarily happen. But you're exactly right to the point of how China scores a lot of own goals, right? That it's, very bullying diplomacy in many respects, what's termed the wolf warrior diplomacy, has caused nations to band together. I mean, one of the great examples is really, China has been calling for the past several years for the dissolution of the US-led alliance system, right? The Chinese say, it's anachronistic, it's targeted against China, should dissolve these. And yet, because of China's actions, right, in the South China Sea, because of its assertiveness, toward Taiwan, we now have an entirely new defense pact in the region, AUKUS, with Australia and the UK. And as you point out, the Quad has become much more robust. India, which had been kind of lackluster participant in some respects. I mean, interested and engaged, but not maybe 110% committed, all of a sudden is much more actively engaged. That's China's own fault. To the point of why why this is happening, I think the audience for the Chinese leadership, first and foremost, is the domestic audience. And I think Xi Jinping is banking on a sense that it sends a message of strength, right, to push back against countries when countries do things that in any way offend China. And again, we used to have these red lines of sort of around the sovereignty issues, but those red lines are proliferating now. So you really never know what might become a sensitive issue to China and cause them to, slap back. And so I think that explains a lot of it, to be frank, that sense that China has for too long, the sort of 100 years of humiliation and that part of this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, Chinese centrality on the global stage, means that China is going to stand up to other countries when those other countries do things that China doesn't like.
In your last answer, you touched on something toward the beginning that I'd love to get your take on, because one hears all the time about the supposed difference in time horizons for thinking and planning between Americans and Chinese, right? So like the trope is, Americans think in quarterly earning reports and 2-year election cycles, and Chinese think in centuries. And I mean, I am not an expert observer like you are, but that seems like Orientalism on steroids to me, because it seems like they try a whole lot of things and some work and some don't, and they adjust when they believe that it's in their interest to do so, and they can be just as daft as us. But I mean, do you see a collective, we're really operating in China on, some grand historical sweep of timeline, and the Americans with their short timeline nature just are not going to be able to compete effectively with that, which seems to be kind of the underlying claim.
Yeah, so I would say that Chinese, have a history even predating the establishment of the People's Republic, in which they operate with 5-year plans, right? Or Xi Jinping, they have a standards 2035 plan, right? Which includes things like how many people they want to have, in standard setting bodies in the United Nations and elsewhere, sort of technical standard setting bodies, and how many different standards they want to set. And so they do, in fact, have that sense of time, right? Where we're going to devote all these resources, and here's how it's going to happen over the next 10 or 15 years. I think the challenge for them, it's kind of a campaign mentality. I think the challenge is that campaign mentality doesn't necessarily produce optimal results, right? And that's where the strength of the US system, which is more efficient, right? Which tends to winnow out, inefficiencies, because it's market-based, kind of marketplace of ideas, and also economic market, does better. And so, you can look and see, in fact, take the standards issue, that yes, China may all of a sudden have 80 different, standards, but actually those standards aren't relevant to anything, right? Because those people are just trying to meet those targets. And so that process of target setting actually, oftentimes means that the ultimate objective is not really realized. And so I think it's a dual-edged sword. So yes, I do agree with the trope, as you put it, that the Chinese, they do set out, long-term plans, long-term objectives, but just as often as not, they don't achieve them. Just like that Confucius Institute example that I gave. And again, part of it is on us, because we tend not to follow up. Right? We tend to just be like, oh my gosh, China said it's going to do this, and the media is all over it, right? And then 5 years, 7 years later, nobody's actually looking to see what the Chinese accomplished. They're just, that whole thing was forgotten, right? Yeah. So I think to some extent, also as scholars, we need to do a better job of, doing impact assessments in many respects. And, it's the same on the last point, It's the same thing when it comes to patents or the number of students that China is educating. You have to look at the quality of the patents, the quality of the education. I remember at one point, I was reading something that says, there are 50,000 scholarships from students from Africa. And it's like, oh my gosh, like the United States, we need to get going on this, right? We want these students coming here to learn about democracy, to enjoy, freedom in the United States. Like, what are we going to do? And then I kept reading and I started, oh, well, some of these scholarships are for like a week, it's like going to some technical university doesn't actually provide anything. Yes, the student might have a good time in Guangzhou, but not that meaningful. Of course, some of them are meaningful. This is not in any way to diminish the effort that China's putting into this. It is significant, but it's just to say, I think we need to look thoroughly, right, at the totality of what China is doing and understand just in a more both nuanced and complete way, what the initiatives actually end up doing, because that should also inform, our response.
Yep. There is a question from the audience. It's from Emily Jin, one of my colleagues at CNES. What should be the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy that applies to both friendly nations like our allies and partners and adversarial nations? Giving an example in international trade, is it possible for the U.S. to coordinate and strengthen joint economic statecraft with partner nations while also trying to engage China directly and requiring commitment from China to abide by international rules and norms? So there's a lot in there, but you may be able to.
Yeah, look, I think that's what international trade organizations are all about. Working through the WTO that has a set of, common standards and principles. Of course, China had a glide path into it, but is I think important. And I think, the United States has traditionally been, let's call it a 75-80% pillar of the international institutions that we helped to create. We've had our moments where we maybe haven't been as good or, as robust participants as we should have been. But I think that to me is the number one way in which we engage both our allies and our quote adversaries, and the UN system as well. And I think if just think across the whole range of UN organizations, and here I'll say, and I am speaking in my personal capacity. I think the Biden administration, is back engaged with the UN Human Rights Council, pushing to support an American candidate for the ITU. And these are very important approaches to bolstering the values and norms that the U.S. supports, but also engaging China, because China plays a big role in all of these institutions, in these international institutions. So if I had to choose one way that we would, again, engage our allies and also seek to cooperate and work with China, it would be to ensure that our international institutions, which do reflect our values, are as robust as possible and use those.
There's another question here. This is from David Wertheim. Are you aware of any internal grumbling about Xi's approach stemming from some of these instances of under-delivery on big promises and declarations by Beijing?
So, David, you probably know as much about this as I do, so perhaps you'd like to chime in on this particular question that you asked. I think it's interesting. So on the issue of the big initiatives, yes, there's been a lot of grumbling, for example, domestically, inside China domestically, about the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So from scholars, from business people, even, Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, who are the ones who have to go and do the cleanup work when, projects go awry and there are a lot of protests around them. So certainly there's grumbling around some of China's big initiatives. I think for me, what's really interesting to consider, and also maybe important for Americans to realize, and a little bit like underneath the surface, is that China is also a polarized society, and that almost perhaps as polarized as the United States, even though our polarization is obviously much more open to the world to see. But just ticking off, I would say, across ethnic lines, right? I mean, think about what China does in Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia. Gender. I mean, I did some work on this and for an article I wrote, and I was shocked to find that, in the World Economic Forum's rankings of sort of women's access to health and the political system and the economy and education, that, during Xi's tenure, so beginning in 2013, actually, that China's fallen from 69th to 113th in terms of sort of gender access. And we know that there's an enormous amount of online hate, for example, that's been expressed toward women in China. I think the division right now between the creative class in China and the bureaucratic class, people who, for their work depend on independence of thought, the ability to be creative. It could be a professor, it could be somebody in the technology sector. I think we can see that this is very challenging for people in this world. And, I have a lot of Chinese colleagues who said they simply aren't providing policy advice, policy papers to the leadership, because if they provide advice that differs substantially from what the direction in which she's moving the country, that they're concerned about their careers. So I think that's a problem. And then of course massive inequality, which Xi Jinping is trying to address, I think, through his common prosperity. But maybe also there's been some talks, some musings, and I haven't followed this closely, that's run into some troubles. And certainly, I think, there was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day, just last week, by Kevin Rudd, where he talked about how in some of in the theoretical journal, and sure there were a few articles by theoreticians talking about, over-centralization of power, that this was a problem, and reminding people of the benefits of the Dengist approach, the Deng Xiaoping approach. And that's clearly a hit against Xi Jinping. So, I think there are lots of rumblings, but as you know, today, China is much more repressive politically. The internet is much more constrained than it was, say, in 2010, 2011. And so it's far more difficult for us to see this kind of discontent that is, maybe burbling under the surface than it was back then.
How does that, some of these things net out for you in terms of this overarching question about whether China is rising in power or declining in power? I mean, the assumption's been China's rising, but there's this school of thought. It's hard for me to see how broad this school of thought is, but that, okay, look at the demographic challenge because of the one-child policy, look at the stock of non-performing loans in Chinese banks, look at slowing economic growth rates, look at environmental problems, you can go on and on and on. And actually, no, it's the declining power, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more or less of a challenge for us, but the answer to that seems to be relevant to how we think about what to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting, question. And I think probably both are true, right? Yeah. So it can be a rising power economically and militarily. I mean, its economy continues to grow, right? Its GDP continues to grow. Its military continues to grow and become more sophisticated. Its presence globally is growing, and it's going to have more military bases or military logistics bases. It has one now, it's going to have more. So I think you can see on the global stage, very clear markers of China's growing influence and power. At the same time, is it sort of sick inside, right? Is it corroding inside? And I think that's also possible, but I do think it's hard for us to tell. Again, we don't have the kind of visibility into China's domestic politics, to sort of societal trends and thinking. It was never perfect, that's for sure, but it was a lot better than it is now. And so it's really hard to assess, I think, how strong those forces that would contribute to decline inside China are. And you point to some. I mean, look at the real estate sector. That's been an ongoing problem for well over a decade, since before Xi Jinping, came to power. People have been talking about it as a significant challenge. Now it really seems to be sort of, coming out to a point where they're going to have to tackle it in a more significant way. But what are they going to do about it, right? I mean, real estate represents, as an extended form, including construction, et cetera, more than a quarter of the GDP. Something like 70% of individuals' wealth is tied up in real estate, and yet it's highly over leveraged. And so how are they going to address that? And are they prepared to make the structural changes? That I think that there are big questions out there for China, but the economists can't seem to come to any kind of agreement on what's going on. So hard, I think, for us political scientists to do it. But I think there are a number of challenges, that China is facing on the domestic front that mean that serious ones that mean that we have to remain vigilant, right? That China rise scenario, or mantra should always be tempered with a check, a consistent check on what else is going on inside the country.
Yeah. There's another question here. This is from Jonathan Sine. With regard to the PRC's expansive non-market economy practices, i.e. China Inc., where do you stand in terms of U.S. economic response? For example, Aaron Friedberg has put this idea of partial disengagement on the table. I don't know if you saw Aaron's recent article on that, if you were doing the people's work in government, but he's got a long article in the Texas National Security Review articulating this idea of a partial disengagement of some aspects of the economy. What can or should the U.S. do unilaterally to protect U.S. domestic workers and innovation capacity?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so here, this is kind of crossing a line because this is the kind of work that I do, this kind of thing I do think about in my commerce job. I think what I would say is that the US government is not only highly attuned to the issues that are being raised here, but extremely active in thinking through responses and, looking at the export controls, thinking about things like the CHIPS Act, right, to build up our own semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, thinking about how the United States can, ensure that, critical technologies, stay in the United States from inception, through scaling up and deployment. And there's a lot going on here, a lot. So I would say in that particular sector, in that sort of area of tech competition and the US-China, broader economic competition, this is something that the government is very highly focused on. I think more broadly, I would say that U.S. companies that don't engage national security issues, right, that don't touch on national, our ability to protect ourselves, and don't engage, human rights issues, that we do want, American companies to be making money from, exports to China or from doing business in China. I personally want Starbucks to, sell lattes in China. I think companies can be important elements of American soft power, everywhere in the world, not just China. So I think, I haven't read Aaron's article on decoupling, so I don't know what the argument is, but I would say it's something that, we should approach very cautiously, but also with an eye again to our national security and human rights priorities.
I will get back to China proper here in a second, but while you're talking about the Commerce Department, I think especially because we have a lot of students who are tuning in and will tune into this, maybe you could say a word about the role of the Department of Commerce in all, not China specifically, but all these big foreign policy questions. I mean, when I worked at State on the NSC staff years ago, I mean, I think I was vaguely aware that there was a Department of Commerce, but when you're when you're focused on fighting wars in the Middle East and some of this other stuff, it was less central to the questions of the day, and now it is entirely central to the questions. I mean, you almost can't exaggerate the centrality of the Department of Commerce to all of the big foreign policy issues that are filling the Washington agenda these days. And yet I'm not sure how broadly that is understood, other than those who are kind of in the mix. I mean, when you're student, you often think, well, diplomats do the foreign policy and spies steal the secrets and the Pentagon, does the defense stuff. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the the work that the department is doing now on some of these key issues.
Sure. So this feels like an advertisement opportunity for commerce. All I
think it's
all I
important.
can say is, first of all, commerce rocks, and we have like the best secretary ever, Gina Raimondo, bar none. Okay. Having said that, both of which are true, we really are. Commerce really is kind of central, as you say, and I'd say, I mean, it can be thought of in the China context, and that is the way I think of it most of the time, but I think it's broadly applicable, as you suggest, to any foreign policy area. I mean, you know, commerce is, when the president talks about building resilience in the American economy, that's commerce, right? That's everything that we do, from things like, you know, supporting small and medium enterprises to the development of tech hubs, you know, to, you know, sort of thinking about broadband. All of this, again, the CHIPS Act, all of this is about making America more competitive. And that's commerce on the domestic side. You know, when you think about sort of protecting the United States, you know, to the previous question, against sort of unfair Chinese economic practices or malign Chinese economic practices, that's also commerce, right? We work on the entities list. We're part of the CFIUS process. We are, obviously we have export controls. We have, you know, we are the center point for all of that. Maybe you would call it defensive effort that the government undertakes. Increasingly in commerce, and I think it's a function of both the importance of the issues, and I would say also the secretary, who has like the personality to do diplomacy, is part and parcel of working with allies, which is another big part of the Biden administration's overarching foreign policy. And so when you look at something like the Quad, you know, the Commerce Secretary co-leads the emerging and critical technology working group within the Quad, right? All the work on supply chains comes out of commerce. Look at the US-EU, the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, similarly, commerce secretaries everywhere. And if you look at the new push on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that's entirely headed by commerce. And that's, you know, really our economic diplomacy. And that's a big initiative. It's the first time since the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States has had a major, which of course we pulled out of, so we're not part of the CPT, what is now the CPTPP, but this is the biggest sort of US initiative in the region economically. So, and again, that's commerce. So I think, and then I guess the last point I'll make is there is, of course, that element of engagement that still exists, or guardrails. And here too, you know, export promotion, you know, is a positive and sort of hopefully neutralizing element in a contentious relationship. And so I think, you know, we're active there as well. And, you know, we work very hard on the ground in China and from here as well on things like intellectual property rights, right? Working with the Chinese, pressing them, but helping them write legislation and improve their intellectual property rights protection. So there's a lot going on, and commerce is right at the heart of it all.
All right, so there's a message.
Thanks for that, Richard.
There's a message to anybody who wants to be part of the foreign policy action that you should. One last question about commerce, and then we'll get back to, you know, this minor question of whether China and all that. But what does engagement with the private sector look like from the Department of Commerce? Because, you know, uniquely compared to some of the other foreign policy or if our national security agencies, the role of the private sector and what commerce does is all important. So how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we engage in the private sector at every level, again, from, you know, small and medium enterprises and sort of, you know, digital upskilling exercises and efforts, and you know, thinking, how do we support minority-owned businesses? So a lot on the ground here in the United States deals with, you know, help working with the private sector. Private sector engagement, I think, in this administration is also a lot about rowing in the same direction. And here I'll just give you my private way of thinking of this, but I think it encapsulates some of the administration's thinking, but it really is my own. And that is that, look, the US government has provided and does provide the norms and the rules, the international institutions that have enabled US business to thrive globally, right, to become global leaders. At the same time, US business provides the innovation and the wealth creation, the jobs that enable the US government to play the kind of leadership role that it does on the global stage. And so to my mind, and I feel pretty confident in the mind of my secretary, although, again, this is my personal articulation, US government and US business should partner, right? And I think on the China front, that look, there's a process of education, and for both sides, right? Understanding, what's going on with the business sector, in China, in certain areas, how can we help the business sector think their supply chains? How can we help them? And then, how can the business sector help the US government be more competitive? And so we have a lot of really good conversations around these issues. So I think part of why I love being here, frankly, is, thinking about that kind of partnership, because I think it's really important.
That's great. All right, so back to China. One of the points that you made, that you've made in writing, which I think is really interesting, and I'd love to draw you out a little bit about it, is, so if you look at sort of the 5 kind of goals that you outlined, big picture stuff that China seeks, a lot of it is about China centrality, as opposed to a broader, more positive sort of global agenda. So, okay, let's say that China acquired the status and the globally dominant role that it would like to have. Well, then what? What does it want to do with that? And for all of our mistakes and flaws, the United States is pretty good at articulating a vision of what we would like to see obtained that goes beyond America's centrality. And so we've got a lot of practice at doing this. But do you see any sort of evolution or vision percolating around about that? Or is it just kind of a pretty flat discussion that doesn't get beyond the China centrality?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really actually sparked my desire to even start writing the book was, when President Trump was in power and was withdrawing the United States from a lot of multilateral institutions, there was this narrative that developed that China was going to step into the breach, right? That the US was leaving a vacuum and China was going to fill it. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Like, what would that actually look like? Like, what does that mean? And is that actually true? And so as I explored that issue and looked at what China did when it had the opportunity, right? Because it did have 4 years of an opportunity to step up and to lead, right? To replace the United States as the sort of preeminent global power. Like many people thought that's what would happen. It didn't do that at all, right? There was no Chinese leadership on global climate change. China didn't step up and say, hey, let's develop an agreement on methane or ramp up our CO2 commitments. There was no real initiative. Xi Jinping talked a good game, said China's going to lead on climate change, China's going to lead on globalization. Going to lead on globalization when it doesn't support the free flow of capital and ideas and information. But nonetheless, he went out there and talked about it. And so as I looked really very carefully at what China was doing in international institutions, I came to the conclusion that, what China wanted was really to have that centrality to advance China's own narrow interests. And, you can see that it occupies, it did occupy like 2 years ago, 4 of the 15 major leadership positions in the 15 of the major UN agencies and programs. And you'd see how they would use their positions, the Chinese officials would use their positions to advance China's interests and then even brag about it. And there's a case, for example, where Wu Hongbo, who's the Undersecretary General for Development and Economic, Undersecretary General, Economic and Social Affairs, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, And he was personally responsible for ensuring that the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Dolkun Issa, didn't testify when he was supposed to, testify before a UN organization. And then he went on Chinese television and said, yes, as a Chinese official, that's my job, to protect the motherland's interest. Well, that's not his job. His job is to, be an international, representative, represent the goals and objectives of the institution, not of China. But again, in time after time, you would see, at the International Civil Aviation Organization, right? They would block people on the Twitter feed of the organization who supported Taiwan's membership. You're not supposed to do that. So I found it actually really interesting to see how China used the power that it actually had. And again, there are also a number of really interesting cases where China would say, we're going to donate, or we're going to provide $2 billion, right, for, say, just development or something. And then you'd track that and you'd find out that like a third of it fed back into Belt and Road projects, right? So, and the people that were in charge of the disbursement of the money were overwhelmingly Chinese officials. So it was just a really interesting exercise, frankly, to take stock and see, okay, you have this opportunity, China, what do you do with it on the sort of grand scale? And then when you do have some kind of leadership, right, within an organization, how do you manage that? So let me say, though, having said all of that, I do see in China, among Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials in particular, a growing interest in playing a larger role on the global stage, becoming more active in peacekeeping, certainly, but also negotiation processes, right? Sort of dipping their toe into, little conflicts, not little conflicts, big conflicts, but thinking about a way that they could play a mediation role. So I think, slowly but surely, we will see more Chinese diplomacy in ways that will push them out front. But I think for a long time, they have not felt as though they have the capacity or the experience to play that kind of role. So the way I think about it is that China wants the rights of being the global superpower, but not the responsibilities.
I mean, the period from early 2020 through, I don't know, mid 2021, to me seems like the absolutely exceptional opportunity for China to prove your broader point wrong. Because, you had China recover from coronavirus faster than anybody else, and certainly faster than us. You have the United States absolutely reeling. The entire country shut down. We have protests on our streets. We have a president who's already saying that the election that he thinks he still might win is not going to be, you go to downtown Washington, D.C., and it's boarded up and there's razor wire and there's nobody around. We're in the worst depression or recession since the the United States exited stage left on the global stage for a good year. We were so internally focused, so distracted, so in crisis. And China had already kind of emerged, and it could have organized an international vaccine distribution campaign with China in the lead of this. Or it could have said, we're going to get all the G20 countries a la after global financial crisis, we're going to try to coordinate fiscal policy. We know the Americans probably won't want to play ball, but we're going to do this anyway. Or you can imagine 5 different things that they could have done with this exceptional time when the United States was pretty inactive, and yet none of that. It was a squandered opportunity, and they filled in the blank by antagonizing a bunch of countries to their wolf warrior tactics. So to me, it was a pretty exceptional case that I think demonstrates the truth of your broader point here over a number of years. There's a question here from Chaitanya, who's a SIS, a School of International Studies student at American University. How do the changing demographics of China, with a larger dependent population and younger generations not wanting to have more children, impact its long-term economic development goals, both internally and abroad? Will the economic consequences due to it result in a changed governance model, maybe justifying Xi's gradual inward turn on economics?
So I followed the first part of that. I lost the last part about how that's going to lead to a internal turn. I lost the connection.
Yeah, I'm not totally, I think this may be getting at the dual circulation, or at least the focus on the internal market, as opposed to the export-led, we're going to be the world's workshop. But I'm reading, reading between the lines. So Chaitanya, if that's wrong, let us know.
Okay. So yeah, demographics is a challenge that the Chinese government has not yet been able to address. And, you know, they moved from the one-child policy to the two-child policy around 2016, 2015. They had a bump of 1 year where they had more babies than the previous year. And then since then is declined every year since. It is at the lowest level since the founding of the PRC. Interestingly, marriage rate has also declined every year since Xi Jinping came to power. So, you know, and China has some very weird and obscure rules about, well, I shouldn't maybe put it that way. Let's just say they have some regulations around who can and cannot, you know, freeze eggs to have children later, adopt children, whatever. So they also, they limit themselves actually also in terms of their birth policy in some other respects. But this is something that, you know, the Chinese government is very, very concerned about. And so you find some local, and they've moved, I should say, from a 1 to a 2 to a 3-child policy. The local governments, you know, talking about like penalizing women who don't have children. Right? I mean, it's, you know, from the 1-child policy where if you tried to have more than one, you know, really bad things could happen to you, to a position where now if you don't have the children, you can be penalized. So it's a big issue. You know, what are the real costs? I mean, there are a couple. So, you know, one is certainly China's ability to support its aging population. I mean, fairly simply, if you look across China's provinces, I think a third of them basically have essentially bankrupt pension systems. And by 2030, you know, that number is going to double unless something changes dramatically. So, you know, you just have too few, you know, young, you know, working age people putting money into the system to support people who are no longer working. That's one problem. The other problem, and sometimes people don't really think of it this way, but I do since I'm older, and that is that, you know, young people are the innovators in an economy, and they're also the ones who adapt to technology more quickly. And so, I mean, it's not true across the board. It's certainly true in my case, but that also has implications for China's rise as a technological power, right? Because if they don't have a lot of young people, you know, moving forward through the system, then I think that technology race becomes more difficult for them. In terms of, so I think those are two important implications of the challenge that they're facing in demographics. There's a broader issue, and there's been a lot written about this, you know, over the past year or so, about a desire, you know, for young Chinese simply to opt out of the system, right? Not to be engaged in the competitive, you know, go-go economy of China. And it's interesting, and I haven't done any, you know, real research or thinking about this, but what is contributing to that, you know, would be interesting to think about in a deeper way. Because again, here too, right, you can see in the Chinese media, you know, these calls like, you know, this kind of lying down, you know, thing for young people cannot be allowed, right? You are actually not allowed to simply opt out. You have to get back in there for the good of the country and start working and contributing. So there's I think a lot of interesting, tied in with the demographics, a lot of interesting trends, social trends in China that I think really bears some good scholarly and policy research to understand better. I guess, you know, in terms of what it means for dual circulation, yeah, I mean, if you have a shrinking population and, you know, potentially declining productivity, then that dual circulation model doesn't work so well. And so, you know, I don't think that's something necessarily that has entered into Xi Jinping's mind. I don't think that's, you know, in the moment what he's thinking about, but I think it's a valid point, you know, moving forward that really, they won't be able to manage that. And in any case, they really can't when you look at things like agriculture, et cetera.
Okay, two last questions, and then we're gonna let you get back to the people's work because the country needs you. Unification with Taiwan, it seems like Xi Jinping wants peaceful unification with Taiwan, but knows he can't have it. So now what?
What's the other question? Are we gonna do two at the same time?
Yeah, let's do, okay, so let's
Yeah.
do that. So that's
Yeah.
number one. And then the second one is, at least some of the external messaging are from Chinese sources these days kind of suggest that they want a stable external environment. They've got the Olympics coming up. They got the 20th Party Congress in the fall, and Xi Jinping will get a new term. Historically, the Chinese have wanted a sort of stable external environment for those kind of events. And then it's after that the question marks begin. So I guess it's now three questions. So one, is that the right assumption to have about kind of what you think that they're aiming for externally this year? And then two, does that suggest that the real period of volatility might begin following the party conference?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so and the kind of in some ways they're linked a little bit potentially. So unification with Taiwan. Yes, Xi Jinping is not going to get peaceful unification because people in Taiwan, by and large, are not interested in unifying with the mainland. So what to do now? This is a big debate in the field of China, foreign policy analysis. So I would say there are those, and I put myself in this group, that are more alarmed by Xi Jinping's rhetoric, that take him very seriously when he says that, unification with Taiwan is one of the 14 must-do items. When he says there can be no great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation without, unification with Taiwan. Well, he says reunification. I say unification, but reunification with Taiwan. So I take all of that seriously because I think there are few things as important to Xi Jinping, save his, grasp on power, as important to him as sovereignty issues. And I think he's willing to go to the mat for sovereignty issues. I think he's willing to endure a lot of instability in the system. I think he's has a much higher risk tolerance than previous Chinese leaders. So I'm quite concerned that, if he doesn't see a peaceful path forward, and I haven't found many Chinese colleagues when I ask them, what is this peaceful path forward, who can articulate it to me, that at some point when he believes the Chinese PLA, that the People's Liberation Army is capable of efficiently dispatching with Taiwan, that he might undertake some kind of military action. So I put that as a top concern for me personally in any case. And then in terms of, so is this a greater risk in the post-Xi third term after fall of this year? I would say yes, it is a greater risk. But, if we take a step back, you were talking about that COVID period, where China could have, really emerged as a global leader. And what did it do instead, right? It undertook all of this military assertiveness, right? That's when it had the border, first deadly border conflict with India. It was going into Malaysian, and Indonesian, water and airspace. It's, 100 days bothering Japan and the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. It puts out its reclaim of some contested territory with Bhutan. So while I tend to agree with the analysis that it does want a stable international environment for the next, 9 months or so, I also would just say there is the potential for unpredictability with Xi Jinping. And, if things really went south for him, if the economy, for whatever reason, just really went south, and he needed to rally the nationalism and get the troops behind him again, could you imagine some kind of manufactured external crisis that would require some, bold move? I could imagine that. I'm not saying that it's a high likelihood, but I don't think we should ignore it. Maybe it's a 1 or 2% chance, but I do think we should just keep it out there someplace in the back of our minds.
Great. Well, Liz, thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. I guess the last thing I will say is that someone once told me that you pay greatest tribute to an author, not by reading their book, but by buying their book. So once again,
firm believer in that. Just buy it. I don't care whether you read it. Just buy it.
Her book is The World According to China. I checked, and it is on Amazon in a Kindle edition, if anyone is interested in that. But seriously, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion today. It was absolutely fantastic, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Richard. I enjoyed it, and thanks for the great questions.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody.